Welcome, everyone. This is the Remembering Who You Truly Are event hosted and created by Jocelyn Mercado, and I am Taria Ward. I'm assisting Jocelyn with some of the interviews. It is my great pleasure and privilege to do so. And today I'm very excited to be interviewing Danny Martin, who I'm excited to have our listeners hear all that Danny has to share with us. I met Danny for the first time in 1993 at the Parliament of the World's Religions, where Danny was speaking. And we became very fast friends and later colleagues, and have shared a life journey of great exploration since then. So I am so happy to be able to introduce you to Dr. Danny Martin. And for those of you who don't know of Danny's work, I'll read just a short bio here. Danny is a coach who has a strong practical and theoretical foundation in ecology, philosophy, spirituality, communication, and leadership. A longtime coach with many years of experience in designing, training, and facilitating dialogues in multiple contexts, including spiritual guidance. A proven success in leadership ability, teaching, organizational development, and leadership training. Danny's vision is an ecological society where ecology refers to the myriad networks of relationships that constitute all life, including the human. This vision includes essential, though often ignored, dimensions of human life, such as meaning and purpose, and what he would call the spiritual. Welcome, Danny.
Thank you, Taria. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you in a particular way.
Yes, it's lovely.
25 years, huh?
Yes, 25 years. We remembered that this morning. It's been a good long journey together as friends. Mm-hmm. So, Danny, just start. Tell us what shaped your journey and give us a taste of what you want to talk about for this Remembering the Truth of Who We Really Are event.
Well, I thought, first of all, the title intrigued me, Remembering the Truth of Who You Are. Wow, powerful title. But it was the word remembering that sort of stirred in me first. Uh-huh. And I think you even said in some of the information about remembering is more than just simply calling to mind, but the word itself, remembering, has to do with putting back together again a little bit. Mm-hmm. And sometimes in new ways is what I have found, that there is a kind of a very proactive process of reconstituting and reshaping in the light of experiences that have shaped you and touched you. And I'm thinking, I was reminded that the word religion has kind of comparable roots. Re ligare means to literally bind back together. Oh. So I thought that, in a sense, true religion is like sacred remembering. Oh. And so it's remembering, and perhaps the word sacred for me has a sense of more comprehensive, fuller, richer, not something esoteric necessarily, but who we truly are. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, true religion is truly remembering who we are. Mm-hmm. The other part of it, I was reminded, I did a PhD with Thomas Berry. Mm-hmm. Some people will know as perhaps one of the early voices of ecology and theology. And one of the things that he used to say was that, in human beings, the universe has come to self-reflective consciousness. Mm-hmm. In a very real way. We, sounds awfully grandiose, but when you put it in that framework, we are the universe come to consciousness. I'm reminded of a little statement that I don't know where it comes from, but I've often used it. Through my eyes, the stars look back on themselves in wonder. Mm. It's like the consciousness is not simply mine as an isolated, separate individual, but the consciousness of the universe, the whole process, come to consciousness. And so it sort of suggests to me a particular role for human beings, not just for me individually, but for all of us, which is to articulate, to be, to celebrate, to contribute that self-reflective consciousness, which is informed by the universe, by everything in a true sense. You know me, Tarja, as someone who loves passionately poetry.
Yes.
One of my favorite companions over the years has been Rainer Maria Rilke.
Yes.
And one of the themes that runs through his work all the time is this notion of human beings as playing this role of articulating, of saying, of speaking. One place he writes, perhaps we are here in order to say, house, bridge, fountain, gate, pitcher, fruit tree, window, at most column, tower. But to say them, you must understand, to say them more intensely than the things themselves ever dreamed of existing. What a fabulous thought that, in a way, and it relates to that old story in the book of Genesis of man giving names to the animals.
Yes.
And I recall Bob Dylan picked it up and put it into a song. Man gave names to all the animals in the beginning, long time ago, you know. And but it's more than just a nice little fairy tale. It's really a statement of this role that the human beings play of giving names, of articulating, of saying them even more intensely than the things themselves ever dreamed of existing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think my life and work has been this kind of remembering.
Mm.
There's a Greek word, poiesis, you may be familiar with.
Yes.
And you hear it in medical terms, hematopoiesis is like the production of blood cells. But in the philosophical context, poiesis is more like drawing out what is already there, but is maybe not apparent or visible. And I feel that that's something that remembering is about. It's like giving name to, giving voice to what some people call praise, celebrating life. And so what I like to do in this conversation with you is describe, I suppose, how the art of poiesis has been articulated in my own life journey, how it has emerged, and how I've kind of come to understand it a little bit more formally, and what I think might be sort of a method for fostering, cultivating the art of poiesis, the art of remembering and drawing out and playing that role, which is for me the true role of every human being, not just me. So that's kind of my thoughts. And maybe I could offer a little taste of that with you. Maybe we could experiment for everyone.
Absolutely. Yes. Whenever you feel that, I realize I didn't even mention your topic, which is dialogue for life. Mm-hmm. So tell us about that topic and how that your poiesis comes into this work that you do around dialogue. I'd love to hear something about your journey that led you into the dialogue work and your deep appreciation for what that method is about for us.
Well, I'll say just one or two words about dialogue as I understand it now, but then I'll go back and have a look at the process that might have led to this place.
Yes.
But I love words, and so the roots of words intrigue me. Mm-hmm. Dialogue comes from dia, logos in Greek. And the two words are interesting. Logos is meaning, and dia is through. So there is a sense of meaning coming through, like poiesis. Mm-hmm. In a sense, it's dialogue for me is literally participating in the emergence of meaning. Oh, and for the ancient Greeks, logos had a sense of ultimate meaning. Mm-hmm. So for them, it was a sacred task, dialogue. Logos is the word that is used to define God, the Word of God in the Gospel of St. John. In the beginning was the Logos, mm-hmm. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word became God, and so on. So it was a sense of a sacred task. So I'll put that aside for a moment and talk about like where I came from and how it spilled into that. You know, I was born in Belfast. You can hear in my accent, it's a little different from the normal accent around these parts. But I'm the son of a mystic mother and a philosopher father.
Oh, beautiful.
Now, given the circumstances, they didn't develop those skills in a formal or professional way. But they so impacted all of their children. It's very clear. I can see the fruits of that. And my mother sort of provided me with kind of a framework, if you like, of a universe that was so much bigger than the one that we were told about, you know, on TV and in school and so on. And my father, who was a master carpenter by trade, offered principles and practices, in a sense, for living in that larger world. I can remember at his funeral service speaking, and one of the things, a little anecdote that I said about him, he was a cabinet maker in a special way. And when he was putting up a cabinet, he used to dip the screws in Vaseline. Mm-hmm. And we would say, Daddy, why did you do that? And he says, I will be pushing up the daisies, as we say, long since dead, when they take down this cabinet. But it will make it a little easier for the person who has to take it down.
Oh.
We'll talk about a larger sense of
Wow.
stuff and practical, simple ways. And he would always say to always leave a place a little bit better than you found it. Not a lot. You don't have to, just a little bit better than you found it. And that applied to everything. A conversation, a moment. So they were my parents. And I also grew up in a Catholic world of Northern Ireland, defensively so because we're aware of the conflict, Protestant Catholic in Belfast. Mm-hmm. But that also presented a world of angels and saints and spirits and realms that became natural to me.
Yes.
And one little anecdote is on November 1st, which is All Souls Day, or the Day of the Dead in some of the Hispanic world, we were commissioned as children to go through particular ritual practices to release souls from purgatory. Go figure. We would make lists, ask our mommy and daddy who had died, and we would go, and you had to say, go to the Visit the Blessed Sacrament, as we called it, the church, and say certain prayers for the Pope's intentions, whatever they were. But with every visit, you released a soul from purgatory. So you talk about giving cosmic purpose and meaning to a young life.
How beautiful.
Isn't it powerful?
Oh, it is. It is.
Well, even if it does reflect a certain magical thinking, well, that's part of the developmental process in terms of spiritual or religious development. And it's where we were.
I believe in magic.
Oh, there you go.
Magical thinking to me is powerful and good. And I think Indigenous people, their ways of being responsible for their ancestors, for addressing their needs and praying for them and helping to release them, they take that very seriously. And I just love hearing that as a boy, you had that.
And it felt like this was my participation, my contribution. To talk about remembering the truth of who you are.
Yes.
You were part of a bigger world. So that was my foundation. And then the kind of early practices of exploring this vast universe. Mm-hmm. I can remember the first, because it's so real and present to me now. Black Mountain was behind our house on the outskirts of Belfast. And I would go up there, I was 9, 10 years old, and lie in the heather. And I would become one with the little animals and birds that lived on the mountain slopes. And sometimes I would feel myself as part of the earth itself that seemed to hold me the way the vast ocean that we used to swim in the Irish Sea as children on holidays. And I was fascinated by the notion of being held by this water. And it felt the same way lying on the mountain. And later on, I saw a movie, a film, as we called it, called Gregory's Girl. And it was about a little boy lying with his girlfriend, in the fields, and he's saying to her, you have to hold on. And she's a bit confused, and she says, like, why? He says, and he was from Scotland. It was a Scottish movie. Because we're spinning at 1,000 miles an hour through space. And I thought, what a line. You could have got your girlfriend. And so there I was on Black Mountain. That was my first sense of these vast, infinite spaces that I participated in. But here's the other little piece, and this partly explains the continuing journey. I began to attend, about that age, about 10 years old, Mass every day. Not because I was particularly pious, anyone could tell you that, including my mother, God rest her. And they were not particularly pious either. I was the only one. I started to go to Mass every morning because in those winter morning candle-lit, that church, I had the same sense of a vast universe that I had on Black Mountain.
Oh.
It was a vast universe that I didn't understand, but that I didn't seem to need to be afraid of. So for those years, this was my search. This was my process. And when I would tell my mother about it, of course, she knew about it instinctively, but I was wise enough not to share it too much with others because they would have thought, who is this guy? I certainly didn't share it with my friends. But it brings to mind one particular story. My mother, two of her brothers, Jimmy and Danny, and they were not married at the time. I was the firstborn of the whole generation. And so they took a special interest in me as their nephew, and I sort of appreciated the attention and sometimes the little pocket money that would come part of it. But once they took me to a special place of theirs. I was 13 years old. It was a May evening. They took me to a Trappist monastery. And you'd say, like, okay, how does that attract a young 13-year-old? But later I discovered that for them, living in, if you like, the defensive world of being a Catholic in Belfast, which was somewhat oppressive, the monks helped them, live with that and find meaning and purpose in that challenging world. So they would go there to share their troubles and sort of like spiritual guidance and coaching. And that time I went with them, I can remember this experience. And it was probably a mystical experience, though I didn't use that language at the time. And it was something like this. I was standing on a balcony outside the window of where we were staying. The monks had gone to bed. It was about 8 o'clock on a May evening. The sun is still up in Ireland until 10:30 in Leyden. And I saw a monk in his black and white habit under a tree in a meadow that sloped down to the River Bann, I remember, in the setting sun. And the whole place was illuminated by the setting sun. And something like this happened. Suddenly, I was the monk, but then I was the tree, and then I was the meadow, and then I was the river, and then I was the sun that suffused it all, and it seemed to rush through everything and take me. And all I can say was I was grasped by something. And I didn't know what had happened, and I didn't know how long it lasted, so I didn't speak to anyone about it for a long time. But when I told my mother about it, there was not a problem. But it seemed to me that this was something that I needed to pursue. This was my journey. And what it did was, for the remainder of my school years, up until I was 18 or so, I would take many of my school holidays and hitchhike, thumb lift, down to the monastery, which was about 30 miles away, to stay there and continue to explore. The monks thought I was probably crazy, because here's this young man staying in an old Victorian guest house. They went to bed at 7 o'clock in the winter nights to get up at 2 or 3 in the morning. And I was on my own. I'm like 15, 16. I would tell my father the excuse, I was there to study. But it was something else that I was exploring and cultivating. And in fact, in the last school summer, while I was waiting for results of the state exams, I spent a month with these monks. And it really did grab me. And but at the end of the month, and the express purpose was to discover, my life's journey, my path. And despite encouragement from all the monks, because I was a novelty around the place and affable and personable and so forth, even in the silence, these were silent monks. I left them on it. I left it. I said, it was, for me, it wasn't, I found that they didn't seem to be cultivating this kind of strange, deep place. They were more interested in right behavior and the rote and ritual of their chanting and their so forth and so on. And when I would speak to them about it, they didn't seem to be quite know what I was talking about. It was a little too primitive or too pagan or something in its way.
Oh.
And so suddenly I find myself on the rebound, because it was my last summer at school, in a seminary. That's what I was like, the rebound, like, after a little bit of a relationship with a girlfriend who drops you. And I bounced into this seminary. It was a missionary seminary because in some ways, where do you put this impulse? Mm-hmm. As a young kid in Northern Ireland, but in the priesthood. But the irony was I was not interested in priesthood. I mean, the priests did not attract me, and the world, the ecclesiastical world. So somehow, in retrospect, I convinced myself that maybe I could search in the wilderness of Africa, which seemed to reflect these vast spaces that I had tasted. Uh-huh. But of course, when I went to the seminary, I realized it was more about right behavior and rules and regulations, and even the meditation sort of methods of Saint Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuits, was more about conjuring up images of heroes, saints, and Jesus who could motivate you to keep the rules and right behavior. It didn't quite connect. But I stayed 8 years. And I think there were probably two reasons. One was the beauty of the land that I lived in, where the seminary was located, the Wicklow Hills, south of Dublin. And the land provided so many portals into this infinite space that I could taste. I would wander in the woods. And that kept me there. And the other was rumors of changes that were coming from above. There had been a big Vatican Council in Rome during those years, and they began to talk about a God who was not confined to the Catholic Church, and revelation that was more than books, but rather the deep murmurings, from human experience, and a different approach to life. That the Church was going to be a real force for justice and liberation in the modern world. And that kept me going, even though I kept running up against the institution time and time again. And so it sort of flung me into the wilds of Africa in 1973 for 11 years.
That's what I was about to ask you about. Tell us a little bit about your adventure in Africa. I'm sure that led to your love of the dialogue work and all that. So please, that's a great story.
Well, in Africa, again, it was like the beauty of the desert, mm-hmm. like the land, the Wicklow Hills, helped me to be there, because the desert after the rains, mm-hmm. I had never seen anything like it. I grew up in rainy Ireland where it was green all the time, mm-hmm. but to suddenly see a barren, because it was semi-desert wasteland, explode into light and color, illuminated, that for me was like mystical, time and time again. Mm. And so things like the water waiting for the rain, the drought itself, like holding on and watching, there is a concept, it's not a phenomenon in desert lands, and in the local language it was called munino. And what happened was before the rains actually came, the dried bushes began to put out shoots, almost in anticipation of the rain. And sometimes the rain didn't come and they would die back again. But that notion was such a powerful experience for me. Oh. The other part of it was kind of related to the Vatican Council that I mentioned, was my work was really about engaging local people in their own lives and taking responsibility and developing their own lives in their own ways, inspired by the gospel message, but guided much more by educationalists like Paulo Freire, or the pedagogy of the oppressed writer. And so it was a whole period of that probably because I was good at it, they kicked me into graduate work in Rome. So I found myself in Rome in the Gregorian University, and where I saw that the world really was changing. But I also saw for the first time, it hit me hard, that the establishment was not going to relinquish control. And the first sign of that was the election of John Paul II in 1978. Same time when as Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, all attempts to retract and pull it back to the old way, the way we were, sort of thing, make America great. We're so familiar with that term, unfortunately. And so when I went back to Africa, there had been a sea change, and this is where it begins to become a little closer to dialogue too. We were told there had been an attempted coup, and then the oppression that came afterwards included oppression of efforts like ours, who were trying to help people think for themselves and challenge systems and organize themselves into cooperatives and so on, all part of a justice liberation sort of process. And we were told by our own superiors to keep our heads down and keep quiet so that we could stay and serve our people. And I instead began to advocate for two different things. One was the multiplication of ministries to allow people who were natural leaders and healers and so forth in their own communities to emerge. And two, the second thing I advocated for was strategic withdrawal of missionaries, which was hardly popular with the institution. But for me, it was a way of creating space and trust for people to respond in their own way to a valid message, but it had to be their response, and not some kind of a neo-colonial one-size-fits-all. Yes. It was the model and the method. So suddenly, it became clear to me that after 3 years of trying to do this, that I had to leave if I was to continue to explore my real contribution, my real work, which was this participating in the vast spaces of this infinite universe, of tapping into this reality that constitutes everything and that informs everything. That was my original calling, I suppose, the truth of who I am. And I was constantly looking for ways, but this threw me into a very radical transition, as you can imagine. One little footnote on that piece of my journey was I realized, but this was much later, I realize it now, that where my love for dialogue and my appreciation of it started was there. Because with these people, that was the way they addressed challenges. They connected deeply with each other. They never engaged in an interaction without connecting at a deep level, personal level. Then they knew when they were there, they were present then. Then they would explore, and everybody had their say. And for someone from an impatient culture like me, it used to be so exasperating and frustrating. It was like, again, again.
We're going to talk about this?
And again, and they would keep on. But they then seemed to know when that exploration was finished. The differences, they hadn't necessarily agreed, but they'd understood each other clearly. Then they went into this third stage of discovering. They began to talk about, and you could feel it. It was coming from the collective and articulation of that. And they would build something together. And then at the end of it, they knew what to do. They knew when to stop. So in that sense, I had a kind of a tool, a surprising gift that I brought into the next stage of my life in the United States, where I came in 1984.
I remember, Danny, one of my favorite, and I quote it occasionally, stories that I remember hearing you say was, when you were in Africa, and there you are, a Catholic missionary priest, and supposed to be in this role of showing them how to do stuff. And so you probably engaged that to whatever extent you felt true to it, but then they started showing you how they did stuff, and you go, oh, you do it that way? And you liked their way. So that is it was like they were converting you in a certain way as you were there to convert them. And the dialogic process was just so in you to be learning from them as much as you had to offer them. And I've always enjoyed that story.
You make such an important point that dialogue is mutually enhancing, or it's not dialogue.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I remember the authorities, my superiors, asking me to write about mission after I'd been there for a couple of years. And of course, I wrote had more to do with this, that missionary was, if anything, was a bridge between cultures, who facilitated a mutually enhancing process, that it wasn't just a neo-colonial imposition of a set of beliefs and practices on another culture, which is the way what mission had become, but something else, something much more akin to this. So suddenly I find myself in America, the land of the free. But that was interesting because I came on a one-way ticket. My superiors, when I suggested to them that I was going to explore further, I needed further understanding of the framework of our world in order to be a missionary or be whoever I am. They were insisting that I go back to Rome for such further understanding. And I had said, been there, done that. We have to go where people are really exploring this, maybe on the edges, the human sciences I was thinking of. And I walked away empty-handed with nothing and arrived in this country on a one-way ticket with no money. And I had set up at least someone who allowed me to work in a parish in return for bed and board, while I pursued a dissertation or a PhD program in Fordham. And so I was living in that on the East Coast for a while. And, that was wonderful in its own way, but it didn't last too long, that sort of little ecclesiastical pause. They caught on to me soon enough that this is a disturber. And I find myself outside, but it kind of shaped me nonetheless, because I was able to do a PhD with Thomas Berry, who in some ways was the first within the Catholic world to offer a framework that seemed at least moving in the direction of the vast universe that I had experienced in the within of things. He talked about a universe and a cosmology and the need for a new story that would redefine what it means to be a human being and so on. And that was a big, big piece of that work. But, having been catapulted out of the parish in that little sort of pause in my transition, I really was forced to let go, because I was at sea. I was in stage 2 of the transition, which is a stage of uncertainty, staying on the 3rd floor of a friend's house. But it allowed me to sort of step into new forms for this search for who I am and whatever I can contribute. And I found myself working for the UN Environment Program. You remember some of that. And I also sort of got involved with my local community in applying dialogue skills to addressing climate change, which has resulted in a very powerful movement here locally in the town. I got involved in various other things. I created a non-profit to develop an Earth Charter from a spiritual or religious perspective for the Earth Summit in Brazil in 1992. I was director of global issues for a conference center. All of these things were converging, and we brought our Earth Charter, our famous Earth Charter, to Rio, Brazil. That's a whole other story I could spend time on, but it was all part of my looking for new forms and platforms, I suppose, to make whatever contribution I thought
Mhm.
I should be making, to be a priest, really.
Mhm.
But in ways that were certainly outside of the system, had become clear to me that I was not interested in or capable of uh, transforming that institution or taking it on even in some
Mhm.
kind of a reformation,
Mhm.
but was much more of a I don't know, a freer spirit, an outsider, I don't know, certainly a seeker. In fact, I used to, when I would go to conferences and they would say occupation, I never would write priest. I would always write seeker
Oh, beautiful. Yeah.
for years and years.
Yeah.
But the Earth Charter gave me a kind of uh, at least the beginnings of a framework for this world. And it was that catapulted me into dialogue in a more explicit way, where switches were all, where we also collaborated way back
Yes.
5 years ago.
We discovered dialogue at the same place at the Parliament. Is that correct? Isn't that where we both
Yes, a little bit.
about
That
it
was
as
it.
a formal method? Is that right?
Well, I'll tell you this. Here's another little anecdote you probably may or may not remember or know. I was giving a retreat for a big parish from Atlanta,
Uh-huh.
and I was speaking about the Earth Charter. And after the presentation, someone came up to me and said, "You know, that was fascinating. How would you create a health charter?" And it turned out he was one of the directors of the Centers for Disease Control.
Mm-hmm.
And so that led to a relationship, and he used to send me out to various parts of the country to have conversations with people who were thinking about public health in new ways.
Uh,
And dialogue began to sort of happen spontaneously. And then I realized that there was a dialogue training program by some MIT folks, and that's for you. And I became involved, and including that director from the CDC, and we did this training program, and that brought me into a role of a consultant for many years with the Centers for Disease Control.
mm-hmm.
And then subsequently as a consultant for lots of other organizations, and using dialogue, the art of dialogue, as, if you like, the basic tool for a culture
Mm-hmm.
that would be creative, or for leadership that would create the spaces for logos to emerge, for meaning to emerge, creative workplaces, and so on. And so for many years, that was my work.
Yes. Now, Danny, before we do our exercise with it, I'd love to have our listeners be able to hear you describe something about dialogue as a method, how you encountered it and how you think about it or teach it. Just a little summary of so they understand what you mean when you say dialogue as a method.
Let me sort of do it this way.
Okay.
I'll give you another little vignette, a little story that was partly a reflection of my stumbling into this magic of dialogue. There is a race that happens near us. It's called the Leatherman's Loop, and it's a 10K once a year. It's almost like a rite of spring. It attracts about 1,500 runners, and they run through rivers and mud flats and up slopes. I ran it many, many, many times. I was invited to begin the race, and it turned into a role of spiritual advisor to the Leatherman's Loop, which is one of my prized roles and contributions. But it has so much to do with dialogue, because these 1,500 people come from all walks of life, from brokers on Wall Street to plumbers, to people who are national level runners, to people running with prostheses, to people who are legally blind, helping each other, running for different causes. And they see it as a sacred event. And it's like a dialogue. And the dialogue starts with, as all dialogue does, the way I understand it, with connecting. Mm-hmm. The way I mentioned they did in Africa. So what we do, I have developed a Celtic Navajo chant. Talk about pulling together pieces of the past to sort of distill the moment before the race. 1,500 people all geared up to run. You could hear a pin drop. I'm standing on a step ladder with a little microphone and a speaker so that people can hear. And the chant is, beauty before me as I run, beauty behind me as I run, beauty below me as I run, beauty above me as I run. You can hear the Navajo piece in it, the Celtic piece, if you're familiar with that breastplate of St. Patrick, Christ be before me, Christ be behind me. It is like a mantra for these. So the first part is this connection. And it's before a race, before they step into it, this interaction with each other and with the land. And then they go off like any race. But as I used to run it, people would be yelling after me, beauty before me as I run. Where's the beauty? And I would say, oh, she just disappeared around the corner ahead, you know. People would tell me afterwards it was like a mantra that would keep them going.
Oh, lovely.
It was also a connection with each other. The second part of dialogue is exploring, you know, whatever it is that's in the field. Not, and it's usually expressed and obviously in the participants, the 2 or 3 or 4 or 20 people that you're dialoguing with. The purpose is to understand. It's not to agree with or convince, to understand. And it requires really deep listening. And of course, deep listening means listening also to yourself and to the way we get triggered and tend to judge and react. When you become aware of that, when you listen within, it lends itself rather to inquiry, asking the questions so that you can deepen your understanding. So that whole race, think of the image, there is that exploration of the rivers and the trees and each other, and they're bouncing off each other and they're laughing and they're crying and they're collapsing and helping each other up. There's a fascinating sort of process.
Yes.
The third stage of dialogue is discovery. It's like epiphany. It's a revelation, because it is. It's something that we generate together when differences are held. That's the way I understand it. It's the tension between differences, like the tension between notes that creates music, or the opposite poles of energy, negative and positive, that generates electricity. I think it happens whenever we interact in ways like this, where we're trying to hold our differences. And you can feel that as people come over that finish line. Those that are first, who, as I said, often are national level runners, are there running back, cheering on the other ones, coming through. And there is a sense of such euphoria that is hard to imagine given 10K or more. Actually, it's surprisingly longer. They don't tell you that it's actually 6.7 miles. But coming out of that mud and all of this, the sense of connectedness and togetherness that they then express, you know, and it's expressed in little sort of simple prize giving. So that third stage of dialogue is expressed in ways that you wouldn't expect in this thing that takes, some people it takes them like 40 minutes to run. Others it takes, like me, 70 minutes to run, and others it'll take 2 hours. But there is a dialogue, and it takes away that notion of dialogue as being like discussion, which is really the exchange of perspectives and comparison and analysis, or debate, which is much more about winning and convincing and beating down. That's what it means. Dialogue is a way of interacting that we can, so that we can access that infinite space, that reality that I experienced on Black Mountain, or in the morning winter masses, or in that monastery that time, or in Africa when the desert would explode. That we've all tasted in good conversations and good interactions, some of them surprisingly so. And you feel yourself saying, it doesn't matter who said it, but ideas bubble up.
Right.
You know that you're part of a collective, that you're being held by the ocean, the vast ocean,
Right.
that informs us.
Reminds me of Jung's work with connecting with the collective field of consciousness, which includes, as you always say, the humans is just a tiny piece of that. You know, the consciousness of the entire organism that we are as a universe. How to tap into that collective, and that the dialogue work really does help assist us with that.
And I have found, as I said, using it as a consultant, that it helps a team
Mm-hmm.
access capacities that it wouldn't otherwise do.
Mm-hmm.
In the context of spiritual guidance, which I do, it's a simple tool for helping someone access this deeper self,
Mm-hmm.
who we truly are.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe there is a little segue into a taste that you and I might demonstrate and experiment with. Are you ready?
I'm ready. I have no idea what we're going to do, but I'm with you, Danny. I'll follow you, and it'll be fun.
Well, let me sort of give this preface.
Okay.
That about a year or more ago, I decided I would pull together two things which seem like opposites: meditation and dialogue.
Uh-huh.
Dialogue seems to, one associates with words and conversation, and meditation we associate with silence. But I thought, how could we help people, most of whom will never meditate in their lives, but do talk, and maybe the two being brought together might offer something. And I was really experimenting with it. It's been going on for about a year and a half now in the local town, and it draws anything from 15 to 20 people, and many of them therapists for some reason or other. And we go through a process that marries, if you like, or integrates silence into the three stages of dialogue of connecting, exploring, and discovering. So what we will do now, a little taste of that.
Okay.
And my gift, as we talked about before, is, I've written about this, and so there will be an article people should be able to access, which will include a simple outline of this process of meditation dialogue that you can do with one other or 10 others. And I've even put in a little form of maybe a way of doing it on your own. Mm-hmm. Even though it might seem self-contradictory, meditation dialogue on your own. But so here we go. Let me invite us, and we'll take 5 minutes just to be silent and be present to this moment and all that it has stirred up. The only suggestion I would make is maybe your breath might help. Maybe awareness of your body might help. Maybe letting go of thoughts that come up might help. So for 2 minutes, we'll do that, and then we'll share a little bit. So much as I'm loath to break the spell of silence, let me invite you, anything that stirred in you, to share, and then I'll do the same.
It surprised me how quickly I was able to put down the thoughts that as soon as I still, all the, what I got to do, what issues are up or whatever, it's just like, through the breath, I guess, was able to just let that go. And then I was just listening to, there are birds outside, there's water running outside, there's wind. So then I was listening to the greater dialogue in which I'm sitting, even my refrigerator running, which is try to let that be a part of the conversation as well. And enjoying just feeling like just one particle in this vast space that I'm in, just in my home and yard. And then there was a warmth that came into my heart, Danny, that I felt happy to tune into. Just this warm-heartedness that seemed to be glowing like the little hearth at the center of what we're doing. So I guess that's about as far as it went for me in those 2 minutes.
So resonate with that, which is what happens when we kind of share at that place. We do connect. All of the above, and for me, I couldn't help but find myself back on Black Mountain, or in those places where I would taste the infinite. And so it was like back again, and it was at this stage of my life. I just turned 70 a little while ago, and it's feels so significant in its way, like I'm gathering up stuff. And it's almost like I want to gather up myself. When we say things like pull yourself together, I think it has more meaning than we realize.
Oh, yes.
You know, and holding that with gratitude and wonder. And I think what happens in this little stage of connection is a sense of wonder.
Yes.
So let's take a second now as a transition into the second stage of dialogue, which I call exploring. Savor this first one of connecting. So just for a moment, we'll be silent for a minute to savor it, and then I'll share a little piece of a poem.
Okay.
And I'll set the scene.
Okay. All right.
And so, savoring that connection that you and I have, I know, but in this moment, it feels heightened, deepened.
Yes.
Maybe it's a place to insert a little piece of poetry that might touch us and guide an exploration, the second stage of dialogue. And it's in the tradition of what in the Catholic world is called Lectio Divina, divine reading, where a person would take a piece of scripture or writing from one of the mystics and read a piece, and maybe just a phrase or a word might surface. So I will offer two stanzas from a longer piece by my friend Rilke, and see what it stirs in us. We'll be silent and let it stir, even ask ourselves questions, and then we'll share. And he says, to work with things in the indescribable relationship is not too hard for us. The pattern grows more intricate and subtle, and being swept along is not enough. Take your practiced powers and stretch them out until they span the chasm between two contradictions. For the God wants to know herself in you. Let me say it one more time as a way of just giving us a moment to savor and touch and pick up on a word. To work with things in the indescribable relationship is not too hard for us. The pattern grows more intricate and subtle, and being swept along is not enough. Take your practiced powers and stretch them out until they span the chasm between two contradictions. for the God wants to know herself in you. So let's take 2 minutes. It's a taste, it's only a little piece to explore. Maybe it's a word, maybe it's a phrase. So let me offer you the opportunity. What did it touch in you?
Well, it took me right back to where I ended with in the prior quiet time, which was that place in the heart, that this warmth that I'm experiencing. But I really focused on uh, the words practiced powers. And I thought, okay, what are my practiced powers? Being swept along is not enough. What are the powers that are mine to practice, that I have cultivated and explored and developed? And how do I take that and stretch it out from the heart and enfold, envelop the opposites so that the God can know herself in what I'm doing? Because certainly the God is these opposites, is fully in each opposite. And how do my practiced powers facilitate holding that together in a beautiful way? So I'm going to meditate more on that, Danny. That's beautiful. Just what are my practice powers and how do I then stretch them out like this?
And I find myself going to, and being swept along is not enough. First of all, it's like today, like so many people, I'm a little frustrated at the kind of world and where it seems to be going for all kinds of obvious reasons. So that was one. There's a certain timing and timeliness about this. And like my practice powers too. One of my favorite words in recent years is deliberateness.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
yes, we do lots of things, but could we do them more deliberately?
Oh,
You know, that it smacks of consciousness, but it's more like my father,
uh,
the master carpenter. You did things with deliberateness in order for it to happen. You do, most things you don't really control, but there are things that you do control, and so to do them with that kind of thoughtfulness, the way he always approached things, the little details, allowed then this world of my mother's to emerge. And so I was reminded of them too, how
uh,
their relationship worked, that
uh-huh.
they offered these different things to each other. And it made me think maybe of another little piece of Rilke, but I'll tell you what, I'll hold that as a way of closing.
Okay.
So let's step into the third stage of dialogue. Let's be silent for a moment and see what our exploration, granted it could go on much longer, we see that is already beginning to generate. Are there thoughts, insights, an epiphany, an awakening? Like you touched on, I'm going to meditate more on that. So whatever comes up, well, let's experiment with it. So we'll take a minute of silence and then we'll talk for 2 minutes again and then we'll begin to pull it together.
Okay. Mm.
well, I'm sure even in that short little moment, things are surfacing, revelations,
Yes.
in a sense, without being grandiose about it. So what came up for you?
What came up really quite quickly was what you said about it was so lovely. And if we were in a time when we had more time, I would want you to describe more how your father and his deliberateness, how that made space for your mother to then show up in her way. And I felt that that as like a discovery, like a revelation, like when I stand fully in my own practiced powers, how does that make space for someone else to then show up fully in their practice powers and hold, like create the possibility more for someone else to step into their own unique powers and gifts, and the responsibility that we hold space for that as we step into our own, and to create that even as a deliberate sort of purpose for why we do that, to make space for others to contribute in that same way and hold together all of our strengths and encourage the development of each of us that way. So I
love what you're saying. Let me sort of build on it if I can, because it seems like what we were doing just there provides even a simple method and model for doing precisely that. And that while this is nice and fine and comfortable even on our own or in a small sort of setting like this, the implications for everything that's going on in our world are present, whether it's in marriage and what marriage should be. My wife, Anne, as you know, is a therapist and experiences what is happening to the institution of marriage in many ways.
Yes.
And the potential that's there also for new ways. But when we look at leadership around the country, all of our institutions, trust is gone. Could name them. But rather than sort of despair, here's an opportunity, it seems to me, to take a simple little process that could inform all of those. Whether it's teaching, I do a lot of work in schools and teaching with teachers and so on. Maybe as a way of pulling it together, just to be faithful to that 15 minutes as we did, I'm delighted with ourselves. Here's a little piece from Rilke that maybe gives us an opportunity for a way of pulling the larger conversation, but also the meditation together. You may be familiar with this one. I am the rest between two notes, which are somehow always in discord, because death's note wants to climb over. But in the dark interval, reconciled, they stay there trembling, and the song goes on. Beautiful. And for me, it is such a distillation of dialogue for life.
Yes.
It's saying differences are not the problem. Differences are the material. Differences are the foundation for an unfolding universe. At the heart of it is that vast energy that I experienced on Black Mountain that holds everything, but not only holds it, informs everything in a way that's like our breathing. It breathes in into what we call life and breathes out into what we call death. But the rhythms are so much bigger than that, the breathing in and the breathing out, just as with ourselves. And that this process is something that we have always known, it seems, in our ancestors. And I know that. But I tend to see it not so much as if our ancestors held a secret that we lost and have to discover in that sense, but rather I put it into developmental sort of a framework, and think of a child that knew instinctively its oneness with its mother in a pre-differentiated way, knew that it was one, was at home and held by life and trusted life. But then part of its natural and necessary process is differentiation. And the differentiation is letting go of your mother and stepping into uncertainty And of course, there are dangers and challenges, as the mother of any teenager will tell you, of really big challenges, even to survival. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, then the only resolution is the individual, the child, rediscovering community by falling in love in some way that gives a post-differentiated sense of oneness. And I think of ourselves as a species, that's exactly our process. Pre-differentiation, maybe in our earlier forms. Differentiation is our enlightenment period that happened not only in the West, but all over, but built the illusion, as it does with teenagers sometimes, of separateness and control and entitlement, which is what characterizes our species today, with all the dangers that are inherent in that, and that the resolution or our salvation is going to be in falling in love again. Yes. In what somebody described, I think it was a philosopher called Paul Ricoeur. He talked about a post-critical naivete. Yes. And I love that term, that we don't have to lose our critical faculties. We don't have to revert to some kind of naive fundamentalism. Mm-hmm. There's no reversion to childhood. You can't go back. But it is nonetheless like a post-critical naivete, that where we're at home again and rediscover ourselves as if for the first time. Yes. Like T.S. Eliot, and knowing ourselves for the first time. And that for me is, I think, and about a few years ago, I decided to sort of have a little deliberate look at my life. And I went on a pilgrimage back to all the places that had shaped me. Mm. And I began to write a blog, mm-hmm. which I continue to do, as you know. Yes. And it's been my way of thinking aloud this truth of who I am. And, you and I have expressed it both for ourselves and collectively throughout this conversation. And there we are. It's
Danny, thank you so much. This has just been such a pure, effervescent, utter delight to be in this dialogue with you. And in closing, I just wonder what you might, if you have any thoughts about how the listeners now can gather up what we've been talking about and apply it. If there's any thoughts about that. Certainly it will just gestate in them and they'll know what to do. But on the other hand, do you want to leave us with a closing thought on that?
Well, I certainly, lest at the danger of it sounding like promotion, self-promotion, but I will send this piece that I've written as a gift to everyone.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
And it's really reflections. It really echoes what we were talking about mm-hmm. pretty closely. Mm-hmm. But the blog is dannymartin.org, and then there's the blog. And recent pieces, I think, have been myself thinking a lot around these things. And I get a lot of response, most of it privately, because people are shy about commenting publicly on the blog. But it seems that it touches a chord in us. So it's another, maybe one little resource. There's so many wonderful thinkers and writers out there, but it's just my personal contribution. But in the piece that I have shared as a gift, there is a little template for doing this meditation dialogue. Oh, nice. And I would say, play with it. Uh-huh. Try it out with one of your kids or with your lover, your spouse, your friend. Bring it into an office. It doesn't really matter. Experiment and play with it. Try it on your own. It seems to me that the heart of what we're talking about is, and it's always been the case, nothing new in this, but it's going from the particular of the poet mm-hmm. to the universal of the philosopher by holding the two things together. It's like moving from the now to the eternal, from the material to the spiritual. And it's in the moments of every day that vast universe is to be tasted. So enjoy it.
Thank you, Danny. It's just so wonderful to hear the poesis, the poetry of the way you express your thinking. I just am delighted. And so I want to close this now with a great expression of my love and gratitude for your work and what all I have learned from it over the last 25 years. And here's to the continuing friendship with all who are listening now, that we be connected in this field, this collective field that we're in this great event that Jocelyn's created. So.
Well, thank you, Tanya, for giving me the opportunity, and thank you to Jocelyn as well.
Yes. All right. So I guess we'll stop the recording now.
Thank you.